My name is Nadia Ostrov. I am 33 years old. And the night my mother-in-law stood at the head of her Christmas table and told me I did not belong in her home was the night I finally understood that being erased by someone does not make you smaller. It only reveals the size of what they were afraid of. She said it in front of 14 people. The table had been set since 4 in the afternoon. The good china, the tapered candles, the crystal that only came out for occasions the family considered worthy. I had been in that dining room a dozen times over 4 years. I had never once been asked to help set it. "You don't belong here," my mother-in-law said, "and you never did." Her voice was level. She had the particular calm of someone who has been rehearsing a sentence long enough that the emotion has gone out of it and only the architecture remains. "I'd like you to leave." My husband, Marcus, was sitting 3 seats to her left. His hands were flat on the tablecloth. He did not look up. I reached for my coat on the back of my chair. I stood. I said, "Merry Christmas," to no one in particular, and I walked to the front door and let myself out. What none of them knew, what Marcus did not know, what his mother with her good china and her level voice did not know, was that the house they were sitting in had been in my name for 37 days. I had not married into a cruel family. I want to be precise about that because the story is easier to tell if the Ostrovs were simply cold or calculating, and they were not. They were a family organized around a specific center of gravity, and that center was not me. Marcus was the youngest of 3, and the only one who had moved away from the city, where his parents and his 2 older brothers still lived within 12 miles of each other. He had come to our city for graduate school, stayed for a job, and met me at a conference where we had both been presenting work in adjacent fields. He was in urban planning, I was in environmental compliance consulting, and we had argued pleasantly about stormwater management for 40 minutes before either of us thought to exchange contact information. We had been together for 2 years before we married. I had spent most of those 2 years meeting his family in the controlled doses that long-distance family relationships permit, which meant I had understood them in the way you understand a climate from weather reports rather than from living in it. His mother, Vera, was a retired school administrator. She had run a large district for 11 years and carried the residue of institutional authority in a way that some people never entirely put down, a quality of permanent assessment, as though every room she entered was also a room she was evaluating. She was not unkind in obvious ways. She asked questions, remembered answers, sent cards at the correct intervals. What she also did, with a consistency I only recognized in retrospect, was locate the load-bearing assumptions of any situation and position herself at them. The load-bearing assumption in my marriage, as Vera understood it, was Marcus. Not in a possessive way, not in the way of a mother who cannot let go. In a more structural way, she had built a picture of what her son's life should look like, and the picture had a certain set of proportions, and I did not fit them. I was not from the city. I was not from the professional network her family had cultivated over 30 years. I had a career she could not easily explain to her friends, and a set of opinions I did not modulate in the way the family's social register seemed to expect. These were not grounds for rejection. They were grounds for a permanent low-level project of repositioning, a steady ambient pressure, applied with impeccable manners, to move me toward the edges of things. Marcus was aware of it. This is the part that took me the longest to understand fully, and the part that, once understood, changed the shape of everything else. He was aware of his mother's project, and he had decided, before I ever appeared in his life, that the path of least resistance ran through it rather than against it. This was not weakness exactly. It was a survival strategy that had served him for 35 years and had become indistinguishable by the time I met him from his actual preferences. He loved me. I believe that, and I believe it was true in the ways that counted to him. He was kind in private, generous with his attention, genuinely interested in my work. What he could not do, what he had never been asked to do and did not know how to do, was hold a position on my behalf in a room where his mother had taken the opposite one. I had asked him to do it 3 times in 4 years. The first time was at his brother Dominic's birthday dinner, when Vera had described my consulting work as a nice side income to a table of people who knew it was not a side income. Marcus had looked at me afterward and said, "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." The second time was at Easter, when I had been seated at the secondary table, the one in the kitchen with the children and the partners who had married in more recently, while his brother's wives sat at the main table. Marcus had said he hadn't noticed until I mentioned it. The third time was at their anniversary party in October, when Vera had introduced me to a family friend as Marcus's wife. He met her at a work thing, and I had watched Marcus hear it and turned to get another drink. After the October party, I had stopped asking. The house on Crescent Mill Road had belonged to Marcus's parents for 22 years. It was a large colonial in the suburb where the family had always lived, for bedrooms, a formal dining room, a back garden that Vera tended with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. I had spent time in that house across a dozen visits and knew its rhythms the way you know a place you pass through without ever quite arriving in. What I had not known, when I married Marcus, was that the house carried a second mortgage. I found out the way I find out most things that matter in my professional life, by reading documents carefully. My work in environmental compliance meant I spent a significant portion of my time reviewing property records, easement filings, and financial disclosures attached to development sites. I had developed over 8 years the habit of reading real estate documents the way other people read text messages, quickly, with pattern recognition, noticing what was present and what was conspicuously absent. 2 years into our marriage, Marcus had mentioned, in passing, that his parents were having some cash flow complications and had asked if we could help. The amount he named was $18,000, bridge financing, he said, while they sorted out a refinancing situation. I had agreed, and we had transferred the money, and the refinancing had not materialized. 6 months later, there was another conversation, a smaller amount this time, and I had agreed again, and there had been a third conversation after that. I did not agree a fourth time, without asking to see the documents. Marcus had been surprised by the request. Not offended, not angry, surprised, in the way of someone who has not considered that a request might be made. I had explained, as plainly as I could manage, that we had transferred a total of $53,000 to his parents over 14 months, and that I needed to understand the financial situation before we went further. He had said he would ask his father for the documents. His father, Gerald, had sent over a partial set, the original mortgage, the property tax records, and a letter from the bank that was formally worded and substantively incomplete. I had read what was there and spent 2 evenings identifying what was not. Then I had pulled the public property records myself, through the county assessor's database I used regularly for work, and read the full picture. The second mortgage was for $214,000, taken out 4 years before our marriage. There was also a home equity line of credit that had been drawn down almost entirely, another $87,000. The family had been servicing these obligations for years, and the service payments had been consuming a significant portion of Gerald's retirement income and Vera's pension. The $53,000 we had transferred had not been bridge financing. It had been keeping the lights on. I sat with this information for a week before I decided what to do with it. What I did not do was raise it with Marcus immediately. What I did instead was have a conversation with a property attorney named Sylvia Crane, whose firm I had worked with on 2 compliance matters and whose judgment I trusted for its precision. I explained the situation, the amounts transferred, the document gap, the second mortgage. Sylvia listened with the attention she brought to everything, asked 4 questions, and then said, "You have a few options. The most protected one, if the property is eventually going to matter, is to formalize what you've already put in." The conversation that followed took 3 meetings and 6 weeks of document review. What Sylvia identified was that the informal transfers we had made, $53,000 undocumented, constituted an unsecured contribution with no legal standing in the event of any future transaction involving the property. What she proposed and what I agreed to was a formal secured loan agreement, properly documented, that converted our contributions into a lien on the property. Gerald and Vera would need to sign. Marcus had been the one to present it to his parents. I had prepared for this to be a difficult conversation, and it was, Gerald had said, on the phone with Marcus, that it felt like we were treating them like strangers, and Vera had gone quiet in the way she went quiet when something had not gone as she had arranged it. But the alternative, as Sylvia had framed it when Marcus presented the options, was that $53,000 of our money sat in a property we had no standing in, and Marcus, whatever his mother felt about formalities, was a practical enough person to sign the agreement. Gerald and Vera signed 3 months after that first conversation with Sylvia. That had been 18 months before Christmas. What happened in the following year was not something I had planned or anticipated. It was the result of a separate process, one that had been moving through the county assessor's office and the bank's internal review department on its own schedule, indifferent to the Ostroff's family calendar. The bank that held the second mortgage had been acquired by a regional lender 14 months earlier. The regional lender's portfolio review had identified a category of legacy loans, second mortgages issued more than 10 years prior, with specific structural characteristics as candidates for accelerated resolution. The Crescent Mill Road mortgage was in that category. I knew this because I had been tracking it. After the lien agreement, Sylvia had recommended setting up property record alerts on the address, standard practice when you hold a secured interest, and I had done so through the same county system I used for work. The alert had arrived on a Thursday in September, 9 weeks before Christmas. The bank had filed a formal notice of intent to proceed with a negotiated resolution process. I called Sylvia that afternoon. What followed was 6 weeks of document exchange, 2 conference calls with the bank's resolution team, and 1 meeting at Sylvia's office that lasted 4 hours. The bank wanted a clean exit from the legacy portfolio. The property had appreciated. The outstanding balance on the second mortgage, combined with the equity line, was $271,000. The current assessed value was $890,000. There was equity to work with, and the bank's resolution team was prepared to offer a payoff structure that would clear both obligations in exchange for a clean title transfer. Gerald and Vera could not fund the payoff. This was not a surprise. What was a surprise to them, I think, though not entirely to Sylvia, was the sequence of what happened next. Our lien, formally documented and properly perfected, had priority standing in the property's liability structure. In a title transfer scenario, a perfected lien must be satisfied before title can clear. The bank's resolution team had identified this in their document review and had contacted Sylvia directly, 2 weeks before the Christmas dinner, to discuss the path forward. The path forward, as Sylvia laid it out to me on the 15th of November, was this. The bank would accept a payoff that retired both obligations. The payoff amount, $271,000, could be structured as a purchase. If I elected to purchase the property at payoff value, I would acquire title subject to the remaining equity, and our existing lien would roll into the purchase price. The net cost to me after the lien credit was $218,000. I had the funds. For years of careful saving, a modest inheritance from my grandmother that I had kept in a separate account, and a performance bonus from a large compliance contract I had completed in August. I had not discussed any of this with Marcus, not because I was hiding it, but because the account was mine and the bonus was mine and the inheritance was mine, and in the 8 months since the Easter seating arrangement I had been moving, quietly and without announcement, toward a position of independence that I had not yet named to myself, but that I could feel the shape of. I signed the purchase agreement on the 17th of November. Title transferred on the 22nd. The house on Crescent Mill Road had been in my name for 37 days when Vera stood up at the Christmas table and asked me to leave it. I drove to a hotel 11 minutes from the house. It was a mid-range chain with a lobby that smelled of cleaning solution and a Christmas tree made of silver wire near the check-in desk. I asked for a room on an upper floor, took the elevator, set my coat on the bed, and called Sylvia. She answered on the second ring. "She asked you to leave," I said. A short pause. "Did Marcus say anything?"
"No."
"All right." Another pause, briefer. "I'll call Gerald in the morning. I've been expecting this would happen around the holidays." "I know, Nadia." She used my name the way she used it when she was about to say something she had measured carefully. "You don't have to do anything tonight. The documents are filed. The title is recorded. Nothing changes before morning." "I know," I said again. I thanked her and ended the call and sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a few minutes. The room was warm and slightly generic and entirely mine, which was more than I could say for the last 4 Christmases. I ordered room service and ate at the small desk by the window and watched the parking lot below, where the lights from other guests' cars moved in steady arcs across the asphalt, and I thought about the 14 people who were still at that table, finishing dessert in a house they did not own. Gerald called at 8:47 the next morning. I was on my second cup of coffee and had already spoken with Sylvia, who had given me a summary of her conversation with him, a conversation that had lasted 22 minutes and that Gerald had spent, Sylvia told me, in the first 12 cycling through disbelief and in the remaining 10 asking procedural questions with the pragmatic focus of a man who had been a civil engineer for 30 years and knew how to process information when the emotional cost of not processing it was too high. His call to me was brief. He said, "I need to understand what this means for the house." "It means I own it," I said. "The title is in my name. Sylvia has copies of everything." He was quiet. "I'm not interested in putting your family on the street," I said. "That has never been what this was about." "Then what was it about?" I thought about how to answer that. "It was about not giving away things I couldn't afford to lose," I said. "And about making sure that what I put in was protected." "We didn't know," he said. "About the bank's process. We didn't know it had gone that far." "I know you didn't. Vera," he stopped. "She didn't know any of this when she said what she said last night." "I understand that. It doesn't excuse it." "No," I said. "It doesn't." He was quiet again for a moment. "What do you want, Nadia?" It was the first time in 4 years anyone in that family had asked me that question with the intention of hearing the answer. "I want a conversation," I said. "With you and with Vera and with Marcus. A real one. When everyone has had time to read the documents and understand the situation. Sylvia can be present if that helps." He said he would make that happen. The meeting took place 9 days after Christmas, on a Thursday morning, at Sylvia's office. Gerald and Vera came in Gerald's car. Marcus came separately, which was the first indication I had that something in the 48 hours since I had last spoken to him had moved. Sylvia walked everyone through the documents in the order she always walked through documents, chronologically, without commentary, letting the facts carry their own weight. The original mortgage, the equity line, the informal transfers, the lien agreement, the bank's resolution notice, the purchase. Vera sat with her hands in her lap throughout. She had the posture of someone absorbing information that was requiring significant structural adjustment to accommodate. Gerald asked 2 questions, both procedural. Both answered precisely. Marcus asked nothing. He looked at the documents as Sylvia placed them on the table, and his expression had the quality of a man seeing a landscape he thought he knew from a different elevation. When Sylvia finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "I transferred $218,000 of my own money," I said. "Money I had saved and inherited and earned. I did it to protect what we had already put in, and because the alternative was that your parents lost the house to a bank resolution process that had nothing to do with any of us." Vera looked at her hands. "I am not asking for recognition," I said. "I am asking for a conversation about what happens next. The house can stay in my name with a formal lease arrangement that gives your parents security of tenure. Or we can discuss a buyout structure. Or something else. But the conversation has to be real." Marcus looked up. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "I told you about the bank notice in September," I said. "You said you talked to your dad about it." He was quiet. "I waited 3 weeks," I said. "Then I called Sylvia." Another silence. The kind that has a shape, not empty, but occupied by the specific weight of things that have been true for longer than anyone has been willing to say. "I owe you an apology," Vera said. She said it to the table first, then looked up and said it again, to me directly. "For last night, and for a great deal before last night." Her voice was level, the same way it had been level at the table on Christmas evening. But the architecture of the sentence was different. It was not a rehearsed thing. It was something she had arrived at between then and now, and I could hear the distance she had traveled to get there. "Thank you," I said. Marcus reached across the table and put his hand over mine. I looked at it for a moment, his hand on mine, on Sylvia's conference table, 9 days after Christmas, in a room full of documents that told the true version of the past 4 years. I did not move my hand away. I did not squeeze his. I left it where it was and let the moment be what it was, which was a beginning of something I did not yet know the shape of. The lease arrangement took 6 weeks to finalize. Sylvia drafted it with the same precision she brought to everything. Monthly rent set at the carrying cost of the property taxes and insurance, a 5-year term with renewal options, full security of tenure for Gerald and Vera for as long as either of them chose to remain. It was, in Sylvia's assessment, a fair document. Gerald reviewed it with his own attorney, a semi-retired man named Frank Orr who had done the family's legal work for 20 years and who, according to Gerald, said it was more than fair, and signed it on a Tuesday in February. Vera signed without a separate review. I noticed that, and I did not comment on it. Marcus and I spent the 3 months after Christmas in a process that I can only describe accurately as a renegotiation. Not of the marriage, exactly, of the terms of how two people inhabit a shared life. We saw a couples therapist named Dr. Amara Odell, who was methodical and clear-eyed and did not encourage either of us to perform more certainty than we had. We talked about the Easter seating and the October introduction, and the 3 times I had asked Marcus to hold a position, and the 3 times he had not. We talked about what it had meant to him to navigate between me and his family, and what it had cost him, and what it had cost me, and what the accumulated cost of 4 years of that arithmetic looked like when you put it on the table in a room with a professional who is paid to look at it without flinching. We are still married. I want to say that plainly because I know it is the part of the story that is hardest to understand from the outside, and I have stopped trying to make it legible to people who have not lived in a version of it. What I can say is that Marcus is a different person in a room now than he was on Christmas evening. Not a transformed person, not a stranger, but a person who is doing the work of becoming someone who can hold a position, and who is doing it imperfectly and consistently, and without requiring credit for the effort. That is enough. It is more than I had, and I have learned to receive more than I had without treating it with suspicion. Gerald and Vera are still in the house on Crescent Mill Road. I have been back 8 times since Christmas. For Easter, for Gerald's birthday in April, for the 4th of July gathering they hold every year in the back garden, for 3 ordinary Sunday dinners, and for 2 occasions that did not have names but were simply an invitation extended and accepted. The last time I was there, Vera asked me to help her with the centerpiece for the dining room table. She was rearranging a set of low winter branches she had cut from the garden, cedar and something else I didn't know the name of, and she needed a second set of hands to hold the arrangement in place while she wired it. I held it for 20 minutes while she worked, and we did not talk about anything that had happened, and she said, when it was done, that it looked right. I thought about that afterward. The particular quality of a thing that looks right, not perfect, not resolved, not finished, but proportioned correctly to what it is meant to hold. It is a different category from forgiveness and from justice and from moving on. It is something quieter than any of those, and, I think, more durable. My grandmother used to say that a table is only as steady as its least stable egg. She meant it as a practical observation about furniture. I have come to understand it as something else, as a description of the work of building a thing that holds weight over time, which is not a single act and not a single material, but an ongoing attention to what is actually bearing the load. That is the work. The house is mine, and the work is ongoing, and I do not need the table to be perfect to sit at it. The laminated insurance beneficiary form had been in my filing cabinet for 2 years before any of this happened. I mention it because it is the detail that told me, before I had words for it, that I had already understood something about my own situation that I had not yet consciously acknowledged. I had updated the beneficiary designation on my life insurance 2 years into our marriage, a routine administrative task, the kind of thing you do when you file the rest of your annual paperwork, and I had printed the confirmation and laminated it and filed it under my name rather than under the joint household files Marcus, and I kept on the shared drive. I had laminated it because it mattered. I had filed it separately because some part of me already knew, without having examined the knowledge, that the things that mattered most had to be kept where I could put my hands on them quickly. When I cleaned out my home office last spring, reorganizing the filing system, moving older documents to storage, I found the form and held it for a moment. The lamination was intact. My name was on it and the designation I had chosen and the date and the signature. Everything I had put in was still there. I put it back in the cabinet and closed the drawer and went back to work. Some things you keep because they are useful. Some things you keep because they are true. The form was both, And the difference between those two categories had taken me 4 years and one Christmas dinner to understand completely. The steadiest thing in any room is usually the thing nobody thought to look at. When Vera asked me to help with the centerpiece, the first time she had asked me for anything in 4 years, was that the moment you would have held on to, or was it the phone call from Gerald the morning after Christmas when he asked me what I wanted and actually meant it? Subscribe for a new story every week. If this one stayed with you, the next one will too. Like if you made it to the end. It genuinely helps.
Bell.